Doing incredible work. She's published 2 books related to Mexican-American entrepreneurs and a long series of articles that are now being widely discussed and shaping the field in really important ways. So we feel very privileged that she's come to provide not only 1 talk here at the University of Florida, but 2 talks at the University of Florida after long flights. So I think we're really lucky to have her here. So let's please give her a warm welcome.
Thanks so much, Nick. Thank you for getting me here and not getting me lost. Cal was very helpful in not getting me lost, shuffling me around and not getting annoyed with me. Thank you. It's not cold. I just want to get that out.
We're all wearing jackets.
I came out of my hotel room this morning and people were in North Face, like, yeah. And I was like, this is odd. But it's nice to be here. It's nice visiting all of you. Today I'm giving a talk on precarious wealth among Mexican origin entrepreneurs. This is a new piece of work that I've been doing, and it's probably going to, I hope, I'll springboard from that into doing a whole book, maybe on wealth and Latino entrepreneurs. If you know the literature in sociology, they've actually taken up the call to look at wealth among just brown people more generally. So people are starting to write about is there an African American middle class? Is there a Mexican American middle class? Is there a Latino middle class? And that work is coming out of basically the scholarship by people of color, right, who are now themselves entering into the middle class and are now trying to write about it. Because prior to that, so much of the literature was focused on the disadvantaged groups. Now, it's not to say that this is a happy story of incorporation and assimilation and success, although some scholars would like that to be the direction in which the middle class are going, and as an assimilationist dream of achievement and rugged individualism. I tend to take a more critical approach to that, understanding that there's real structural forces in place that tend to dampen people of color's economic progress in the United States. And so I entered into this conversation on the middle class, and I wanted to look at the Mexican origin middle class entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs in particular, because if there's anybody who's doing what you're supposed to be doing in order to achieve the American dream, it's a business owner. And the business owners themselves will tell you that as well. So they will say that they are, the ones who are the hard workers, the pull them up by their bootstraps, the, success from their families. They're the ones who are chasing the American dream. They believe in the American dream against a lot of contrary ideas or assessments of it. So they're real committed to that project of incorporation, and they're middle class. And so from the looks of it, they've achieved economic success. But very much like the middle class that's not entrepreneurial, it's a good idea to look at what that middle class status looks like, because as other white people have shown, the Mexican middle class doesn't look like the white middle class. And the African American middle class doesn't look like the white middle class. These groups are still quite different in terms of their economic achievements. And so we're talking about that with respect to the case of Mexican middle class entrepreneurs. So,
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'll get that later. Oh, no, you won't. So, one of the questions that's kind of, we want to kind of situate this conversation in is the larger question of, what is entrepreneurship when it's done by Mexicans? So a lot of my work, my earlier work and a lot of other people's work tends to look at whether or not Mexican entrepreneurs are a group that actually exists. Like, are they like the Korean entrepreneurs? Are they like the Cuban entrepreneurs? Or are they not like them? There's been a whole lot of literature suggesting that the Mexican middle class is basically a group that is surviving, not thriving, a group that is engaged in self-employment, and they call it self-employment, not entrepreneurship on purpose, to underscore their economic uncertainty and vulnerability. These are people who may have been underemployed in the labor market, who could not get a job, so they didn't really have a choice but to engage in entrepreneurship. So Mexican entrepreneurs, about 6% of the US population, it's a very small number when you compare it to someone like the Korean entrepreneurs, where about 30% of them are entrepreneurial, and white Americans who are entrepreneurial at about 11%, black entrepreneurs at about 5%. So we're at the low end. And so the question is, well, these are just survival strategy entrepreneurs. These are people who couldn't get a job in the regular labor market or couldn't make enough in the labor market because they were being discriminated against. So without very many alternatives, they turned to self-employment. And actually, that's a pretty good story. That captures a lot of what's going on with Mexican entrepreneurs. It's an accurate portrayal. So I've done some work where this is some of my quantitative work, but it's, there's no stats in this. So we can just read sentences. It works. But in some of my quantitative work, well, I've actually looked at, class characteristics of the population, separated them out from lower class and middle class, and then looked at their trajectories of success as measured by self-employment participation and in earnings. The story generally is that Mexican self-employed people do tend to have middle-class backgrounds. So more middle-class Mexicans will engage in self-employment than their working-class counterparts. Okay. So it does seem that self-employment is a draw for a middle-class group of Mexicans. When we look at the earnings that they generate, we're also seeing that middle-class men in particular make more money when they are entrepreneurial. So this is a story that's not that well studied. If we think about those, jardineros or the mobile street vendors, we're not talking about those guys. We're talking about middle-class Mexican entrepreneurs who have skills, who started a business, and then they made more money than they would have if they'd stayed in the general labor market. So that's a very entrepreneurial group in the classic sense of the word. For women, however, the same story is not being told. And when you're looking at things like labor market and self-employment characteristics and demographics, you can usually, without fail, say that the women are having kind of like the not great outcome. So just for any of you that are interested in looking at any aspects of the labor market, just build that into your story, because it's generally true. And it's generally true here. So for middle-class women, they are going to participate less in self-employment than working-class women. And when they do it, they don't make considerably more money than if they had just stayed in the labor market. So if a woman is middle class and she's working in a middle class wage worker job, she's going to make the same amount as that same woman going into self-employment, going into a business. That's not the case for the men. The men do better. And when we compare them with the working class, the earnings for working class folks who leave the wage labor market and start a business, they make less money than they would. They make less money. So what the story is here is that Mexican entrepreneurship is both a survival strategy and a strategy of upward mobility. It especially works well for middle-class men. So middle-class Mexican men would do better if they left a wage labor job and went into entrepreneurship. Women will make the decision to go. They won't necessarily make more earnings, but they sometimes want to do it for other reasons, what we call non-pecuniary benefits of entrepreneurship. And we all know what those are because people talk about them all the time. You want to own your own business, you want to be your own boss, you want to make your own hours. Whether or not these things are actually true in practice, These are the things that may motivate a middle-class woman who might be getting discriminated or having a bad time in her job to go out on her own. She's not going to do better than she was doing, but she's going to do the same. And maybe the benefits that you get from being entrepreneurial are enough, right, to make that jump. And for working class folks, the story really is that it is a survival strategy. Most of the people who might be entering self-employment who are working class then are those people who might be underemployed or unemployed in the general labor market, don't have too many opportunities, so they go into self-employment and then they don't do very well. Not as well as they would have if they had stayed as a wage worker in a full-time job. But as I like to point out, the job where you're your own boss getting paid less than you would in the general labor market is a good job if the alternative is that you don't have a job. Right? If the alternative is unemployment, then at least you have a job. So that's the context in which we're thinking then about the middle class. And in particular, right, the middle class men, they should be making more money, and the middle class women who are at least doing as well as they would have if they'd stayed in the general labor market. What we know about middle class Mexican entrepreneurs is not that much, but there are some studies that are being done. Right now, Jody Agius Vallejo is working on the Mexican middle class, Tomas Jimenez is working on the Mexican middle class, Jessica Vasquez is working on the Mexican middle class, I'm working on the Mexican middle class. Nick, are you working on the Mexican middle class? There's a lot of people right now who are kind of engaged in the Mexican middle class and Latino middle class more generally. And in the couple of things that I've written and that Jody has written on middle class Mexican entrepreneurs, what we can say, and this is kind of consistent with middle class entrepreneurs more generally, that once they get to middle class status as an entrepreneur, they can stay there. So they tend to maintain their middle class status. They don't fall out of it. We can also say that for those who are middle class, they tend to reproduce middle class status to the next generation. So this is very much like you can think about the Korean grocer or the Chinese dry cleaner in the Chinese enclave who works very hard day and night. Their children are working there for free in the weekends. And what happens to those kids? What happens? They go to college. They go to college, and what do they do? They're doctors and lawyers, right? Because those are the two options that immigrant kids of entrepreneurs can do. That's what you can be a doctor or you can be a lawyer. That's your choice, right? That's how it works. And guess what? That reproduces middle class status or even wealth for those kids. So middle class status is reproduced for the entrepreneurs. But it's interesting, right? They're not reproducing entrepreneurship. Because the last thing the parents would say is, I want my middle class kid to work in the laundry for 80 hours a week, or work in the restaurant for 80 hours a week. They don't want that. They want them to go to college and get out. So the question is then, but what about wealth? What about middle class entrepreneurs that are generating wealth in their business, that are doing very well? And is entrepreneurial succession, which is reproducing the business from one generation to the next, that happens. That happens with people with wealth. So business owners with very well-established businesses or multiple businesses that are generating millions of dollars and then have a couple of stores and 50 employees, they do want their kids to take over those businesses. And the kids are generally going to take over those businesses because there's wealth and they're successful. And they're family businesses that they want to pass on. So they're not telling their kids, go be a dentist. They're trying to get those kids to stay. But it only really happens if you have the wealth component. If you just have the middle class, because this is what people don't understand about brown middle class people. Brown middle class people don't necessarily have wealth in the same way that white middle class people have wealth. So there's a distinction that needs to be made between middle class with wealth and middle class without wealth when you're talking about Latino or African American middle class people. And wealth matters, as I said, because it allows us to weather sustained hardships of business. So where a middle class a middle-class business owner with no reserves, it may be making a middle-class income, but is not making enough to weather the storm when the economic downturn hits. Wealth matters because it also facilitates business creation. It facilitates the owner opening another business, or it facilitates the owner giving money to their kid so that their kid can open up a business. Whether it's the same business or a different business, the kid might want their own business in a different area. So it facilitates business creation. It's also important, wealth is also important for immigrant entrepreneurs who are middle class because they may not have the language, they may not have a transferable credential, they might have been a doctor in their country of origin, but now they're here and they can't work as a doctor here. So in those cases, the wealth that they're bringing from their country of origin is critical for them to be able to get started in a business that may allow them, right, to continue to succeed and to continue to, in the style in which they've grown accustomed, right? And it's not a surprise, the old saying, it takes money to make money, is 100% true. So if you have wealth in your business, you are likely to have an outperforming business. The business is going to do better than if you did not have wealth. Okay, so that's the other story is, if you have a lot of money and you start a business, that money helps you be successful in that business. And so then when you have with wealthy businesses that can outperform other businesses where there's no wealth, then you are much more likely to let it go to your children. And that matters, right? Mexican middle-class entrepreneurship matters. If we think about entrepreneurship, especially in the United States, as a way to reproduce the entrepreneurial class. Other groups do that, but minority groups have a hard time, even when they're entrepreneurs, reproducing entrepreneurship to the next generation. So that's where the wealth component comes in. So if we think about the cycle of wealth creation and middle-class entrepreneurs and middle-class entrepreneurs generating wealth, I have an arrow going to the circle, because the arrow might be you're a working class person who opened a business and you did well, so you became middle class. So now you're going to go right into this middle class entrepreneur spot, right? Now some, not all, but some business owners who start from the bottom, these are the stories that we always see on Time Magazine and Geek and Forbes. The rags to riches story of the immigrant or the second generation Mexican American. So there's a space for that person. It's that arrow. They might plop in as a working class entrepreneur, and they might plop in. They also might plop in if they're middle class and decided to start a business on their own. So they're a middle class something, a lawyer. And they said, this is terrible, I don't like this job, I'm going to open up a business. And then they're going to be a middle class entrepreneur as they start because they have money. So you're a middle class entrepreneur. Chances are, if you're middle class, as I showed you in those other things, you're going to generate a middle class income. The question is whether or not you're going to generate wealth. If you generate wealth, then there's a good chance you're going to leave the business to your kids. Ethnic entrepreneurial succession, where you leave your business to your children. And that guy is a middle class entrepreneur already, right? Because they're taking over a business that's already successful. And that's the other way that you can do it. That's the way I recommend, by the way. If you want to do this, be that person. That's the best way to go. Might have to talk to some people about that. All right, so my research design, really simply, is that I had this wonderful opportunity to get these oral histories that were generated by the Kauffman Foundation and UTEP, so the University of Texas at El Paso, who has an oral history center there. And they were doing interviews, life history interviews with middle-class entrepreneurs, Mexican entrepreneurs in El Paso. And I got in on the project. This was not my project and this was not my grant. But I was a consultant on the project, and so I helped with the survey instrument. And so I made sure that I got some of my questions that I wanted to know, because they asked me to consult. What am I going to do? Like, I'm gonna put the stuff that I'd like to see in there. So we kind of came up with a good survey instrument, and I was happy to look at those materials, and then I was just really thrilled to have the opportunity to use the data. All right, so the Paso del Norte Entrepreneurship Oral History Project, that is still ongoing. Right now I stopped it with the 50, but they probably have more than that at this time. Something to consider is that in order to be in this sample, you had to own a business for 5 years. So if you can own a business for 5 years, that's pretty successful, right? Because we do know that like 2/3 of businesses close after 3 years. So the fact that it's still these businesses are still going, we can think about these businesses as pretty successful already. So they're middle class and they're already pretty successful because they've withstood the test of time. And in fact, many, many more of them are well over 5 years, right? So the mean years in business for the men was 26 years, and for women it was 15 years. So these are tried and true businesses. These are established, they've been there for the long haul. You also could think about them as the top 7% of firms among the all Mexican firms. And what qualifies them as the very top 7% is that they have employees. So there's many, many, many hundreds of thousands of more firms that don't have any employees at all. These are just self-employed, one person, unpaid family worker. That's what's really going on in America. And then you have a tiny group that are actually having employees that they pay. So you can think, wow, this is already a pretty elite group of business owners, right? They're top 7% of their firms. They have more than one or more firms. They have one or more paid employees. Most of them have college, and most of them report an income in the middle or the upper ranges of the scale. So between 2 times and 5 times the poverty level of the 2013. Many of them, in fact, most of them own their own business, and most of them own a house. And if you know anything about a house, it's wealth. A house is considered wealth. Owning a business is considered wealth. So these guys have that anyway. You can think about that. I keep thinking about how am I going to think about house as wealth? But we'll get to that. So these are the research questions that I have. What is the relationship between middle class entrepreneurship and wealth accumulation? That's an open question because we can't expect and we can't predict that if you're middle class you have wealth or substantial wealth. The second question I have is, how did the Great Recession, which happened just during the collection of the interviews, how did that affect the Mexican middle class? How did it affect their wealth accumulation? In particular, how did it affect their prospects for passing down the business to their kids, right? Which is, if you have wealth, you're supposed to be able to do that. Or at least they all want to do that, whether or not they're able to do that. So it just so happened that these interviews were taking place at the tail end of the recession. Right? And the recession was 18 months between December 7th and June 2009. But first, let's look at what was happening with wealth generally among Latinos. And what we see is not a good picture. So I want you to think about, too, when we're talking about wealthy middle-class entrepreneurs, this is what it looks like. Pre-recession, Latino households had an average of $23,000 as wealth. That compares with almost $200,000 for white households. And that's pre-recession. That's the good days. Those are the good days. So in the good days, we've got an 8 times differential between white wealth and Latino wealth. After the recession, it's worse. Because what happened was Latinos were the #1 group that got hit with the recession. And they went down to $13,000 in wealth now. And whites have started to stabilize. They haven't gotten back up there, but they're stable now with that wealth. Right? So we have the Latinos still losing wealth after the recession, and whites have stabilized, and this is a 10 times 10 times difference in wealth accumulation. This is what I'm saying. It's important to think about what wealth looks like and how it affects, right, the ability of a middle-class entrepreneur to pass their business on to the next. The Great Recession and Latino wealth, again, to take kind of a bigger picture of it, just to kind of situate the context of this talk. Hispanics lost 66% of their wealth over the course of the recession. The largest percentage loss when compared against blacks and whites. By the way, blacks didn't do so well either. Right? Let's be clear about that. They're not okay either. Whites were doing okay, not a good day, but 16%, I'll take that over 66% chance, right? Loss. Zero or negative wealth in 2005. 23% of Latino households reported they had zero or negative wealth. That compares to 11% of white households. In 2009, it's after the recession, 31% of Latino households had zero negative wealth. Think about it, that's a third of the Latino population. Had zero or negative wealth after the recession. Comparing to 15% of whites. 24% of Latinos had no assets other than a car. That meant that they were renting. They did not have a house. 6% for whites. And Latino wealth disparities also grew because the top 10% of Latino households, of which our entrepreneurs are largely in that group, right? The discrepancy between the top 10 and the rest of Latinos grew from 56% to 72%, which meant that the middle class, the wealthy middle class Mexicans were concentrated. The wealth was concentrated in the upper level, upper distribution, and others were further away. So within you have this group dynamic that's different, and then across groups you can see the differences. So the Great Recession effects on business. The effects of the Great Recession on business were the same as the effects on most recessions on businesses, but it was a particularly bad one. So business dynamism this is the concept whereby smaller, innovative, cheaper businesses could come onto the scene and undercut a more established business, and the competition that those newer and smaller and faster, the business dynamism part, right, were replacing and taking established businesses out of the labor market, or the established business would have a smaller share of the market with these new upstarts coming in. We can talk more about that if we have time, because it's kind of interesting that most economists like the idea of business dynamism, but it doesn't work for my Mexican entrepreneurs. There was also incredible decreased consumer demand that was felt almost overnight. The drop in sales and profits that the entrepreneurs report are between 20 and 50%, but of all the ones that I actually have included here, they all said it was 50%. They lost 50% of their sales and profits like overnight and for a sustained period of time. Constricted investment capital, so that meant that their investors dried up. There was no one else kind of supporting the business. Those people were not going to be giving money in these conditions of recession. And they also had less access to credit and loans because they needed to provide more information in order to qualify, and so they qualified less, and there were fewer opportunities to get a credit line to keep the businesses afloat. So when looking at how the Mexican middle class dealt with the Great Recession effects here, I'm arguing that in my sample of 50, that I saw basically 3 different categories of Mexican middle-class entrepreneurs. The first are wealthy entrepreneurs. They had wealth, they are doing good, and that was a small handful of the sample. The next category is entrepreneurs with modest or some wealth. So they had a house, they had some, maybe another property, maybe another business, they had some accumulated wealth. And the third category was entrepreneurs with really insufficient amounts of wealth, or no wealth to spare to help their business when it was going through these kinds of things that got hit really hard. So what I'm going to do now is just kind of jump into the findings, right? Where I'm going to say, like, okay, so now we know that the recession had a big effect on these businesses. What did our best case scenario of Mexican entrepreneur, what did they do? Right? These guys are as good as it gets. As I said, they're in the top 7%, right? What happened to them? So for the handful of wealthy entrepreneurs, they were okay. No surprise. They were okay. They're a small group. They were fine. They managed the effects of the recession with really, they did not feel it in their home. They didn't feel it. Their employees didn't feel it. They didn't have major impacts. And so they were taking a very much a wait and see approach. They would get a smaller profit share, but there was no change in the day-to-day operations. And even investment plans, expansion plans continued, and this is where the business dynamism aspect of it works for these wealthy middle-class entrepreneurs. They were saying, this is a great time to expand. I can really expand my business now because there's a recession. There's a lot of people, there's a lot of product, there's a lot of opportunities we're in. But they were the smaller category of wealthy. So Raymond, the owner of several high-end dealerships, says, this last year in 2008 was the most challenging year with the recession. It keeps people in their homes and doesn't have them coming out and buying, making big purchases, which really hurt. We're not in a bad situation. We're just not doing as well as we have in the prior years. So we know there's been a drop, but we're fine. Mo is the owner of a locksmith and security company, so he does, it's not just locksmiths, although that's how he started his business, with little locksmith things, but now he does the security for banks. So he's kind of a big guy. I was doing over $1 million worth pre-recession. We're doing half that now because things started going bad, but we're still ahead. The most important thing is to have money at hand at all times. If you don't have money, you're not worth a peanut. So he knew that he was weathering the storm, and he's still making quite a lot of money. So, you know, he's carrying through, he's just buying his time. For the middle-class entrepreneurs with some wealth, they felt immediately the impacts of recession, and they had to do stuff for it immediately. They had to, and so unlike the wealthy people, they felt it and had to do something. They couldn't not do anything. So they drew down the business savings, any savings that they had in the business, money that would have gone back into the business, they pulled that money out, they used that money to meet their daily expenses. At some points, they would sell additional or extra investment property that they might have had as an investment, or an extra house that they might have had, or they might have shuttered a store that was not producing as well as their main store. They did often secure loans or lines of credit from banks because they still had some wealth, so they had collateral and could go ahead and get some extra money, again, to kind of weather the storm. They lowered prices and took a smaller profit share of sales. And for these middle class business owners with some wealth, sometimes they said, well, I was gonna expand the business, but now I'm just gonna hold off and see what happens. But another category of this group in particular was like, if I don't expand the business, I'm going under. And what they would say, actually I have a case of that, so I'll just show that. So Maria, after being turned down by a commercial bank and needed extra money to cover her expenses and payroll and things like that, she secured a loan from the Small Business Administration for her paper supply company. Now, if you know anything about the Small Business Administration, it is bare of an application, and you don't really get them like right off with the recession. I mean, you need to have one before you can get one. It's kind of like that, especially during the recession. She had gone through all of the paperwork and Section 8 stuff, and she had done it for years. So when she needed some extra money and she still had collateral, she could go and get it from the SBA. Joanna said that she slashed prices and she had recession busters sales, that she would call it. She put like little recession buster signs everywhere, trying to get customers to come in and buy things that were much, much cheaper. And she was basically just breaking even at that point, so she wasn't making any money. She just was holding her business up. George, this is the example of George needing to expand his business or risk business closure. I tried to get a bank loan. Well, you don't qualify. So I went to another bank and I had the same situation there. So then I went to the Hispanic Chamber and the same thing happened. I'm going, I'm trying to borrow money so that I can get an infusion and maybe hire some more people. It's sales. I can hire more salesmen. But the good thing is I paid off my house, so that's getting me. And so for him, he didn't need to expand his business to cover payroll. He was doing that. But he wanted to continue to make money. So he was trying to say, I need more sales guys on the floor so that my business will last. And so he tried to expand his business and he used the home equity in his house to do that. So the middle class entrepreneurs with little wealth or with some wealth but insufficient wealth, I want to say, we'll talk about this, but we can think about them as no wealth. They're not no wealth. They have a house, they have a car, that's wealth. But they're not going to be homeless to keep the business going. So no wealth, no usable wealth, no liquid wealth, no business or personal savings, no extra real estate, investor capital or collateral. They would say they had no alternative but to downsize. They must curb a business expansion. There was no, I'm gonna make it a little bit bigger so I can gather. There was none of that talk. They cut their employee hours, which was the hardest thing for them to do. They laid off employees, the hardest thing for them to do. They decreased their own salary, so they weren't making any profit. They slashed prices and they closed businesses. Either the business that they were in had to close, or a subsidiary business, a smaller satellite business, they would close that business. So they were just totally kind of trying to circle the wagons around their business. It used to be a bowl of cherries, but not anymore. I've been choked. And he said that this Steve, the owner of a printing business, was saying that the new printers, right, with the computers at home, these guys were taking over the printing business and just undercutting his giant established business with multi-million-dollar equipment. He couldn't compete with these small operators, he called them garage printers. He couldn't compete with that. That's business dynamism, and it had an effect on him. And he was planning on closing his business. Hernan, who owns a trucking business, and it's an international trucking business. It's right in, it's right in El Paso. It crosses the border. This is a Mexican-U.S. company. Was laying off employees. They kind of know it's coming. Last year, 2008, we did it for about 2 months. If I don't lay off workers, you're putting your head in the sand. As an owner, you're responsible to make those decisions because you don't want to drive the business out of business. So he's making the hard decision to cut the workers. And Fermin, who owns an engineering firm, explained the chilling effect in this way. All of a sudden, I had to worry about making payroll. I never worried about it. All of a sudden, I have to worry about paying the bills, which I didn't worry about. So all of a sudden, it became a financial matter. Okay, do I want to stay open or do I want to close? What am I going to do? It's a very stressful, very desperate situation for them. So let's think about these 3 categories and then think about the potential for our entrepreneurial succession, right? We're back to are we going to pass this business on to our kids? What the owners say is, I'm a first-generation business owner. I'm a first-generation middle-class person. I don't have enough wealth, and I want to leave my business to my kids. But they recognize that they are not, you remember in the cycle? They're not what I told you guys to be. They're not that middle class, entrepreneurial succession guy. It's tougher for minority-owned operators with this recession, given the fact that we don't have deep pockets. We don't have generations of wealth to hold us up. Most of us are first generation people. So if our cash runs out, we can't go to our fathers or grandfathers and say, can you lend me some money? It doesn't work that way. Many of these business owners know wealthy business owners. They know guys who have planes, boats, multiple houses. And they know that those guys got businesses from their parents and grandparents. So say they see the disparity. They want to be those guys, but they're not those guys. And they recognize it. Another entrepreneur, when we were talking about the potential for entrepreneurial succession, if I failed, there was no chance for me. We didn't have anything to inherit. Many of us didn't have any money to inherit. Most of us didn't have anything to inherit. There was nothing to give down to the next kid. We started at ground zero. Now what's interesting about this, and I probably need to play this up a little bit more in my paper, is they're not blaming themselves. That's unusual, especially for rugged individualists who are often like, well, if I don't make it, it's on me. That's what my entrepreneurs typically say. If I work hard enough, I'm going to succeed. They don't say, my grandfather didn't have buckets of wealth, and that's why I'm having a hard time. It's a really interesting, they're making the observation that the wealth part that they're missing matters. They don't blame themselves for it. And yet, as with all of the entrepreneurs I've really ever interviewed over years in my career, they believe in the American dream and they don't really give up. So hats off to them. They do not give up. At the end of the interview, we'll say, so what do you have to feel positive about the future? The questions asked, what are your plans for your children? And they're completely buying and celebrating the American dream and their ability to achieve it. So rugged individualism comes right back in at the end of the interview, and the belief in the American dream, and this is very, very consistent no matter what. I have interviewed people whose stores closed 2 weeks after my interview, and they were still saying, at that point they were saying, I can't wait to, I've become what I wanted to become, I've succeeded, I always knew I was going to be someone when I grew up. 2 weeks later, the store's not there. They just believe in their ability to work hard and succeed. Most suggested, even given all of the evidence, that they were going to fix this problem, they were going to pull out through this recession, and they were going to leave their business to their children stronger than they had it. What motivates me is to get up, make sure that I get this agency to a point where my son doesn't have to struggle the rest of his life. Again, women, it's mostly the sons that are being talked about here. Look, when you start with our business, mijo, it's like running a race. When you have a running start, it makes it a lot easier to win the race. And he's saying, I want to be the person who's giving you that business so that you have that father, right, who's backing you up. So in conclusion, just to kind of sum this up, right, the effects of the recession hurt the top elite group of Mexican origin entrepreneurs. And the effects of the recession continue to affect them, as we saw in that other slide, right? The recovery of the recession is not happening for minority populations. The majority of the middle-class entrepreneurs are first-generation middle class and first-generation business owners, and that's really where the lack of wealth, we could say, is located. Business ownership does not guarantee wealth accumulation. I think that's another really important finding. Neither does being middle class. If you achieve middle class, you're already in college. That's actually one indicator of being middle class. Owning a home is one indicator of being middle class. It's not a guarantee that you will have wealth. So the average wealth of the Latino households right now is $13,000. And most of that is in their house as equity. The majority of the Mexican entrepreneurs did not have adequate reserves to stabilize their businesses during the recession. They had to make immediate and big changes to try to ride out the storm. Guess what that does? It makes it unlikely that they're going to come back and be successful again, or as successful again, or able to accumulate wealth, because they just poured everything they could into just trying to survive. Also, there are different strategies for these people, depending on whether you have a lot of wealth, you have some wealth, or you don't really have wealth that you can use. And entrepreneurs are vulnerable to these economic downturns. Even the more elite are vulnerable to economic downturns, and it's due in particular to insufficient wealth. And then, as many entrepreneurs are, they remain optimistic, even in the face of real economic vulnerability and uncertainty. They still seem to rally around the idea that they're going to be okay, and that they're going to be able to leave their businesses, which are going to be even stronger, to their kids. And I think I'll stop there.
Time for some question and answer. Some questions.
Questions? Comments? Yes.
I have a question. From the about 10% on the top of the Mexican entrepreneurs, what kind of businesses they have?
Yeah, so they have, I wonder if I have just a little, I might have a little snapshot. This is just a snapshot because I couldn't put them all on there. But you can see that they may have a software company, an engineering firm, infotech firm, orthotics and prosthetics firm. Transportation is big in that area. Those are kind of pretty big industries.
Okay.
And yeah, those are the industries that are making
A lot.
big money.
Okay.
Also, in El Paso, they are trying to create a tech hub. You know, they want to be on the front lines of the wall, for example. They want to build that wall. They want to provide the technical assistance for that wall. There's engineers who are trying to get those grants and put those bids in. So those are the kinds of businesses that are generating a lot.
Okay.
Kind of wanted to piggyback on that question. So what's distinctive about that 10%? Because it seems like what you're saying is they might be able to get to that wealth creation, or they have already, or you're in the process. What's different about them from the other 90%?
Yeah, so I mean, they got lucky. They had wealth to begin with. They had a lot of them are middle class to begin with, and so they had connections with investors, right? So they had angel investors. They had relationships. For instance, there was a construction industry where the guy had been working with El Paso government for 30 years before he went out on his own. Well, he could work with anybody in the whole entire city and just kind of dominated that market. So a lot of them are using the kinds of strategies that basically white entrepreneurs with a lot of wealth have, right? They have connections and they have access to social capital, and that helps them go to the next level. Because it's not really necessarily industry, right? Because there's a woman who's in high tech who's not succeeding like the guy that is, right? But the guy that is, you know, he's on boards, he's on the Chamber of Commerce, he's on some philanthropic organizations on that board, so he has connections. Those are the things that do the job.
Are they all like immigrants themselves, or like second, third generation, or they're still?
So this is immigrant generation here, and it's second or third generation. A lot of the men are second and third generation. More of the women were first and second generation.
But were you able to kind of go back into
And
the backgrounds to see like the families or relatives still in Mexico more or less are comparable in terms of social class? Because it's kind of like if they were kind of like upper middle class in Mexico, they kind of like that wealth to begin with,
That's
kind of that wealth was transferred throughout
You're only
generations.
talking about 5 people.
But it is true that it is true, and it's something that we don't think about, right? They're right across the border. The generations go both sides, and they do have wealthy relatives on the other side who could be helping. But that's a rare case. Mostly what it was is if you look at the cycle, this might take forever, so maybe I'm not going to do this. If you look at the little cycle that I made, they're the ones that are coming in on entrepreneurial succession, right? So they took over. Their parents might have been poor, started a business, got it to middle class status. They took it over, and now they're in it. And so it's kind of it's the reproduction of that business. That has happened to a couple of these. You had a question.
Why is it that the recession hit the Latin American population the hardest out of all the other demographic groups?
White supremacy is part of the answer. Part of the answer is it hits us really hard. All minorities, right? And the patriarchy for those of us who are always going to get the bad end of the stick in terms of gender. But one of the ideas of that is that because Latinos have a high immigrant population and they're also dealing with legal status issues, that these are people who may have been in the shadows, and so we're already very vulnerable people, and then when the recession hits those vulnerable people harder. So that is one reason why people say that, when you see that chart and that 66% of Latinos lost, and it was like 53%, I think, of African Americans, they're talking about it because the vulnerable immigrant population really took the hit.
Also, predatory loans and housing market is so big.
The housing market just decimated Black and brown communities. And that wiped out their wealth.
Did you have any data on how they were reproducing this for other maybe Latino people in the community? That was an interest that they would not just for their family, but for other people.
Well, I'm not sure how to answer that. Do you mean so there's this concept called entrepreneurial capital. And what it is, it means that you learn to be an entrepreneur from seeing somebody in your family with a business. And so what happens is because you know what it looks like to own a store, to order products, to hire employees. You might be working in that business too on your summers. That is entrepreneurial capital that you're developing. And it might help you be more likely to start a business because you saw it in your family, people who had businesses and were working in their own businesses. So it makes entrepreneurship a possibility when for somebody who doesn't have any family that's entrepreneurial, they just tend to think about wage work. They just tend to think about the labor market. They don't think about, I'm going to open up a business. So entrepreneurial capital breeds entrepreneurial activity. There are people who would bring in non-family, even non-Mexican Latinos into their business to groom them so that they could participate or take over the business as well. In fact, the orthotics person, that guy, and it's kind of an interesting story, that orthotics business is doing very well. He worked at Baskin-Robbins as a teenager, 16 years old. He was making ice creams. And the orthotics business owner came in and visited that Baskin-Robbins every Friday to have the ice cream and then he'd go home. He struck up a relationship with this kid, and because he didn't have any children of his own, he started to groom the kid to take over his business. And he said, I need someone like you. You're responsible. Give me a little ice cream.
Wow.
And paid for his school.
Wow.
And paid for his school. So he paid for his school, and then when the time happened, he took over the business. And those stories exist out there. There was a woman who's just she's like a go-getter, and a business owner just said, I'm going to train her up, and just brought her into the business, and she took over the business. So those entrepreneurial capital kind of spreads, much more common for men, but it occasionally happens. Does that answer your question?
So you mentioned that the Hispanic Chamber also denied that one and so I was wondering if maybe you've seen that as maybe just a symptom of the recession, or maybe it's not always been as helpful as maybe sometimes it is.
Both of those things are true. So the Hispanic Chamber is a resource for higher end, more established business owners, and they belong to the Hispanic Chamber. Some of them don't choose to belong to the Hispanic chamber. They want to belong to the white, which is not like the white chamber, right? It's just like, because again, right, whiteness, white supremacy. There you go. It's invisible. A Band-Aid isn't a flesh-colored Band-Aid. They don't say the white chamber of commerce. They just say chamber of commerce. And so a lot of people wanted to belong to the chamber and not the Hispanic chamber because they felt like that was maybe more helpful. Of course, there was a lot of issues around that. There's a lot of conflicts there too. But what I found really interesting was that the Hispanic chamber has some opportunities, like they will do, they'll do workshops on how to apply for things, and they'll put people in the room, and they'll try to get a hub together, and they do things like that on kind of on the margins. But a lot of the people who are in that are these people, and they're struggling through the recession too. It's the other part of your answer. So, I meet people who are just like, oh, I got this, the big Hispanic business owner of the year is on their, on their office desk. And they're the same situation these guys are. You won that award, but that award did not protect you, or it doesn't mean that you are so successful that you're invulnerable to a recession. So thinking about who's in the Hispanic chamber, it's all these guys and women who are struggling. Right? And they're still the best. They're still the stronger group. So, it's complicated.
I study the effects of the recession in Spain and immigrants, and I see a lot of things that are similar, but what happened in Spain was the effects were worse in 2011, 2012. Do you see something like that, if it's gone worse?
Well, there are some gains that are coming back, right? So some people are saying that now they're springing back. But the recession it didn't bounce back. It was still bad in 2011 too. And in fact, if you saw that one, I don't want to show it because I can't get to it, but that one where it went to 10, it went from 8 times difference to 10 times difference. That's around there. That's around 2013. So that's still there. And then the other thing about this recession, right, was they call it a man recession. They call it a man session because it hit men harder than it hit women. Other questions? No? All right.
Thank you so much, Zulema.
Thanks.